Welcome to Mideast Realities. Thank you for watching our program. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski. With this program this week, we're going to start a new occasional series. What we're going to do is we're going to directly look at how the American media, the TV media, presents the issues relating to the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and then we're going to comment on the inadequacies, misrepresentations, omissions, all the things that make American coverage of Middle East affairs in the establishment media so inadequate at best. One of the reasons, of course, we have our program, Mideast Realities. It was just a few weeks ago, in fact, during the latest crisis with Iraq, that I was invited a number of times to appear, 3 days in a row, in fact, on Fox News, Fox Cable News. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you the clips from 2 of those 3 days. The third day they've promised us, but it hasn't arrived yet. And I'm going to explain to you why the program was done inadequately, how it was that I was approached, what it was that the interaction between myself and the host and the producers. Actually, these calls tend to come during times of crisis, of course. Radio and TV stations are always looking for talking heads at that time especially. So we got a call one day from the New York producers of Fox News asking if someone from Mideast Realities would be able to go on later that day, and sure enough, they sent their limo, and down to the studio I go. Let's roll that clip, and then I'll explain further.
Welcome back. More UN personnel move out and more military forces move in as the U.S. prepares to take action against Saddam Hussein for his refusal to cooperate with UN arms inspectors. Is a forceful military attack the only way Saddam will learn his lesson, or will he change his course in the 11th hour? Joining us now from Washington, Mark Brzezinski from the Committee on the Middle East and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Juan, let me start with you, if I may. There's an article today by Jim Hoagland in the Washington Post. He says that widespread Iraqi civilian deaths are almost certain if we carry out an attack of the magnitude that we look to be preparing for. Is this really necessary?
Oh, I think it is necessary, David. This is a sad reality. I mean, we're talking about a military action, and it's going to have consequences. There's no getting away from that, and there's no way to pretty up the picture. But it's also a reality that if you allow Saddam Hussein to continue to stockpile his weapons, both his ballistic weapons as well as some of these chemical weapons, that you're talking about widespread death in that region and destabilizing the world. So I think you have to literally put it in perspective, in context, in terms of what we mean. But there's no prettying up the picture. You would have civilian casualties.
Mr. Brzezinski, are widespread Iraqi civilian casualties the price we have to pay for Saddam's intransigence?
Well, David, by asking the question in the way that you're asking it, it sort of elicits one kind of answer.
No, I can take any kind of answer you want to give me. Go ahead.
Many of us believe the policy is absolutely outrageous and immoral, and it's not just analysts and experts like myself. As you know, on our website, MiddleEast.org, we have a list of professors all over the world who have condemned U.S. policy in the Middle East, and specifically toward Iraq. The former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, has actually called our policy war crimes. The UN, Dennis Halliday, has recently resigned after a 33-year career in the UN, protesting the absolutely bankrupt policies of the U.S. and...
But, Mark, I'm asking you to address Juan's statement that if we don't take this action, which will undoubtedly result in civilian deaths in Iraq, there may be more civilian deaths resulting from Saddam Hussein's actions in the future. What do you think?
This isn't about Saddam Hussein. This is about Iraq, the Middle East, and history. Saddam Hussein was less than a decade ago our ally. We were providing him anthrax from Bethesda. We were providing him arms. We were providing him money. This is about American domination and control of the region.
Juan Williams, Mark makes a very good point. Just, a couple of years ago he's our ally. Now he's our enemy. What's to say he won't be our ally again?
Well, you never know, but I mean there's a changing force in terms of international politics and the dynamics, no question, David. But the fact is, at the moment, I think we have been unerringly patient and attempted to make all sorts of consideration. I think if you look back at the way that we've pulled out the UN weapon inspectors, the way that this administration has given a hard time to Scott Ritter, who protested to the point of resigning over the inability to go in and look at exactly what Saddam Hussein was up to, you understand the U.S. is not acting in some preemptory fashion, that we have been patient and thoughtful and we are finally forced to take action against Saddam Hussein. I find it difficult to understand why anyone would say, oh no, you should coddle Saddam Hussein and entertain him all the more because he was once your ally. Well, at the moment, he's very much not only our enemy, but the world's enemy.
Mark, should we coddle Saddam Hussein?
David, this discussion bears little relationship to the realities in the Middle East. Juan and I were talking, he's never been to the Middle East. What we're dealing with is American domination of the region. This is a destroyed country. This country has been
Well, then why is Saddam spending so much money on these chemical weapons?
Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons are puny. Anybody who wants to build anthrax can have it within a few months. Our own Secretary of Defense has told us that. The only country in the Middle East that has substantial weapons of mass destruction is our ally Israel, which, by the way, is 8 times more powerful than all the Arab armies combined.
And that's got to be the last word. Mark Brzezinski, I do want to add, Saddam spends a lot of money on his palaces. Juan Williams in Washington, we thank you very much. Got to take a short break. We're going to be right back with more on the conflict in Iraq. Stay tuned.
The most interesting thing for me at Fox News that day was really the person I was with, Juan Williams. Of course, I've seen Juan on TV quite a bit. He's a general commentator, has been in Washington a long time. Of course, he's on Fox News all the time. I was on only a couple of days. But the interesting conversation that I had with him before we went on the air while we were sitting in the studio, and then he followed me out to the makeup room when they were taking off the makeup, and we continued our discussion. Number one, I hadn't been told that I was going to be appearing with someone else. I had been told, in fact, that I'd be the guest for a particular segment, and that's what I expected. I expected to have, at least 5 minutes to try to put everything in perspective, which I really wasn't able to do because of the nature of the questions that were asked. Juan himself is no Middle East expert at all. He hasn't even been to the Middle East, which of course I interjected there. He knows very little about the Middle East region, and he knows very little about U.S. policies historically toward the Middle East. What he is he's a political expert commentator about the situation in Washington, which of course brings forth the conclusion that many of us have reached in Washington. Foreign policy is domestic politics. In our country, domestic politics takes precedence over international issues. The ramifications of what we do now are not really discussed. The history of how we got to where we are now is not really discussed. What's discussed is the politics of the moment, the very short-term policies that we pursue. Now, in the case of Juan Williams, to finish up on that, I not only found out that he'd never been to the Middle East, not to mention knowing anything about Iraq, but he knew very, very little about domestic American affairs in terms of the specific players dealing with Middle East policy. Now, for instance, Martin Indig. Martin Indig is Assistant Secretary of State to Madeleine Albright for Middle East Affairs, and he was an Australian citizen at the time that Bill Clinton was elected. Martin Indig essentially was a payoff by the Clinton-Gore administration to the Israeli Jewish lobby for helping them win the presidency. Juan Williams did not know who Martin Indig was. He didn't know anything about his background, and he was startled when I explained to him that this person had been an Australian citizen at the time that Bill Clinton was elected to the presidency, and then he was rushed through American citizenship so that he could be appointed to the National Security Council and eventually as Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. Incidentally, it's also well known that Martin Indig was one of about a dozen people sent out to Little Rock by the Israeli Jewish lobby, that's my term for it, during the campaign period in order to position himself close to Clinton to take on these assignments. But more importantly, to get to the actual clip itself, just think about the actual questions that were asked as opposed to what could have been discussed. We could have discussed the historical context of the situation. We could have discussed how Iraq had started off as a major ally of ours, how the Americans actually encouraged in some ways Saddam Hussein to take the policies he took toward Kuwait. Everybody seems to forget that the American ambassador was with Saddam Hussein personally when he had over 100,000 troops on the border of Kuwait. There was no discussion of breaking relations at the time. There was no discussion of any serious American opposition. There was no American military buildup of any kind. What there was, in fact, was an American ambassador saying to the president of Iraq that the United States had no particular views about quote-unquote border disputes between Arab countries. Now, of course, I could go into the history of where Kuwait came from in the first place. The British essentially in the 1920s carving out on a map a little area that they decided to call Kuwait, which was formerly part of Iraq. The whole purpose was to further weaken the Arab regimes, to divide and conquer, which, we all know the historical realities of British imperial policy that the United States has picked up on. Whatever, the clip took, the segment took place. The limo took me back to the office, and within a few hours, to my surprise, there was a call from the New York producer saying, "This was great. Just what we wanted. We really want to call on you more often. Are you ready to come tomorrow to be on the program again?" So, I said fine. They told me the time. The limo was there, and off I went. We don't have the clip of the second day I was on Fox News, the second of the 3 days in a row. They've promised that to us, but it's a few weeks, and though we've followed up with phone calls, we still haven't been able to get it from them. Nevertheless, it was interesting how the second day segment went. Essentially, the discussion was about, the United States is about to bomb, and is this a good policy, and is it necessary, etc., etc. I pointed out that Iraq is a destroyed country, a prostate country, that what's really involved is domination of the entire region by the United States and by Israel, that we're using modern-day gunboat diplomacy. It's now Tomahawk diplomacy, it's cruise missile diplomacy. If we would have had this kind of technology back in the 60s and 70s, I have no doubt that Nasser at the time was the Saddam of today. I have no doubt we would have used cruise missiles on the Nasser government in Egypt, and history would have maybe taken a different course. But nevertheless, we got to a point in the discussion where it was appropriate for me to point out that although Iraq has hardly any weapons to threaten anyone anymore, the country in the Middle East that has significant numbers of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, far more than all the Arab states combined, is the country of Israel. At which point, although the interview was supposed to go on for at least another 3 or 4 minutes, I was politely thanked and cut off, and that was that. I was pretty upset, actually. I had been promised that there'd be more time to deal with these issues. They were the top issues of the day at the time. Everyone expected there would be bombing within a day or two. And I was very surprised that for the second day in a row now, when I mentioned Israel, and when I mentioned the role that Israel plays in the Middle East and Israel's vast arsenal of weapons, and when I knew that the interview was scheduled to last for a number of more minutes, I was thanked, and off they went to commercial. Nevertheless, once again, the limo took me back to the office, and this time I wasn't expecting any further phone calls. I was wrong. The next day was Saturday, in fact, and Saturday morning I got a call from the Washington office of Fox News that was doing the weekend booking in Washington. Would I please come on the air again and discuss with them what's going on? Well, at first I was quite reluctant. First of all, I had other plans scheduled for the time. And second of all, there'd already been a little pattern of not really being able to discuss the real issues and sort of being twisted and turned by the host, who I've never met. But nevertheless, after some discussion, I was promised that, number one, you'll definitely get a significant time period, and we really want to hear what you and your organization stand for, and please come. So, with that basis and with that agreement, I changed my plans and went down for the third day in a row to Fox News. And let's roll that extended segment, and then I'll fill you in a little further about what happened.
Mission control for any military action against Iraq is at the Pentagon, which is where our Steve Centani is standing by with more. Steve?
Well, David, Pentagon officials and White House officials have told us that we were very close, minutes away, from launching a cruise missile attack on Iraq at the moment that Iraq decided to back down and decide to cooperate with those UNSCOM weapons inspectors. Naval sources tell us that they were on full alert. In fact, they were on standby in the Persian Gulf, all the ships that are out there, and that targets had been selected and programmed into cruise missiles to be fired on Iraq. Now, there are some 300 cruise missiles altogether in the Gulf on ships. They're aboard 8 cruisers, destroyers, and attack subs that are stationed out there. Those cruise missiles could also be launched from B-52 bombers. So we understand that the targets had been selected and pre-programmed. The president had given the okay, apparently, for a cruise missile attack, and then the whole thing was called off at the last minute because of the decision by Saddam Hussein to finally cooperate with the UN. A military buildup continues here in spite of the latest word from Iraq. We have airplanes being scrambled from Air Force bases all across the country today. Let's take a look at how it stacks up. We had 6 B-52s that started things off last night by flying out of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. They're heading to the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and as I said, they can fire cruise missiles. We got 6 of those. 28 F-16 fighter jets left today from various Air Force bases. 12 F-15 fighter jets also left. That leaves 6 B-1 bombers still to depart sometime today or tonight. The other 6 B-52 bombers that are going to take off from Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington State, and a dozen F-117 stealth fighters. We understand some of those may have already taken off. We're checking on that. We're also awaiting the deployment of 4,900 Army troops. They're going to be sent over to Kuwait from bases in New York, Georgia, and Texas to watch out just in case we do launch an attack and Saddam Hussein decides to counterattack on Kuwait. They would be there to protect Kuwait. So that's where it stands here at the Pentagon. Things were well underway toward a possible missile attack, a cruise missile attack on Iraq. Plans were underway last night. It would have been carried out by midday today, but at the last minute, Saddam Hussein changed his mind, decided he's going to start cooperating, so the whole thing was called off, at least for now. But all options are still on the table here at the Pentagon. They're not ruling out, of course, the possibility of a military strike on Iraq. And at this point, of course, a deployment continues with aircraft continuing over to the Persian Gulf. At the Pentagon, I'm Steve Centani. David?
Steve, just a simple question I want to get clear in my own mind. How is it that those planes are able to go all the way over to environs around Iraq when their fuel tanks are not big enough?
Well, right. We're not only sending warplanes, but we're sending aerial refueling tankers, KC-10s and KC-135s. There'll be several of those, and they'll be in place at various points around the world, in fact, to refuel the fighter planes that are heading over there.
So they will not have to touch down at various bases along the way?
They will not have to whatsoever. They can refuel in the air once or twice as need be.
Okay. Steve Centani from the Pentagon, thanks very much. Right now, we're joined from Washington by Mark Bruzonsky. He is chairman of the Committee on the Middle East. And Mark, I have a question for you. Was it the threat that we just talked about from the Pentagon, that military threat, that got Saddam to back down?
Well, I think we all assume so. Look, the United States is the only superpower.
I should emphasize, the Iraqis are saying that had absolutely nothing to do with their letter to Kofi Annan.
Well, the words of international diplomacy, the United States is second to none in its duplicity and in the way it manipulates public opinion. The Iraqis, of course, are trying to do the same thing. We are the only superpower. Iraq is practically a defenseless, helpless country. We've killed 10% of its people in this decade. We've destroyed its entire infrastructure. This is a case of gunboat diplomacy in the modern world. Call it Tomahawk or cruise missile diplomacy, if you will. The United States has the power, the money to do whatever it wants, but not without historical cost, not without repercussions, not without things taking place in subsequent years as a result of our policies.
Mark, let me just ask, why is it that Saddam Hussein needs these chemical weapons?
This isn't Saddam Hussein. This is the country of Iraq. The United States policy.
But
the
Saddam Hussein
Anglo-British
is the man who controls the budget. You and I know that.
Well, that's like saying
nobody else controls the budget.
That's like saying that Bill
concerning
Clinton is
chemical and biological weapons programs in Iraq.
I don't agree with you.
You think that there are independent actors who would defy Saddam Hussein within the political structure of Iraq?
When we talk about the United States, the President of the United States, the final decision maker is Bill Clinton. There are institutions that surround Bill Clinton.
Excuse me, Mark, I just asked a simple question. Do you think that there are those who would defy Saddam Hussein within the political structure of Iraq on the weapons
I don't know who you have in mind. Who would defy Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, the original question is who has the purse strings in Iraq? Who controls the chemical weapons programs other than Saddam Hussein?
If you want me to answer your question, I will. All of the regimes in that part of the world are headed by strongmen. Who is going to defy King Fahd? Who is going to defy Assad? Who is going to defy Mubarak? The problem in the United States is that we have this black and white attitude toward everything.
Well, Saddam,
we forget
question then, Mark, the simple question that I'll go back to again, why does Saddam Hussein need the chemical and biological weapons? Excuse me.
I'm afraid the whole premise of your question is inaccurate. The country in the Middle East that has the huge, unprecedented stockpiles of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons is our major ally, and we provide them with these things and with the money and with the political cover. The country is Israel.
Mark Brzezinski, we have to leave it at that. I thank you very much for coming. I'm going to invite you back, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Mark, when I invite you back. But thanks very much for joining us from Washington. We appreciate you coming in. We've got to take a short break. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned for our continuing coverage of the crisis in Iraq.
Well, actually, he never did invite me back, and I think probably it was better that that was the case. That was, as I said, the third day in a row that when I mentioned Israel, and when I mentioned Israel's vast store of nuclear and chemical biological weapons, the interview was quite abruptly brought to an end. Those of you watching it at this point may not realize the context, of course, and you may not realize that, you have no way of realizing without my telling you, that I was supposed to be on for a much longer period of time. I had only agreed on the third day, on the weekend Saturday, to go down to the studio if, in fact, I would have a chance to discuss the background, historical significance, the real bigger picture to what was going on, rather than just the bombing campaign. But also, remember the questions that were asked, the simplicity of the questions, all the softball nature of the questions. First, he asks his own Pentagon correspondent, gee, how did these planes, manage to fly from here to there, as if we all don't know about refueling in the air. I mean, this has been going on for a couple generations, maybe even back to World War II and Korea days, for all I know. And yet, that's the kind of question the host in New York asks his Pentagon correspondent. And then when he gets me, an expert to talk about the Middle East, they've tracked down for the weekend, he wants to ask, was it the threat of American force that caused the Iraqis to back down? Well, I mean, pretty obviously there's only one superpower in the world. The United States was getting ready to pulverize and destroy Iraq and maybe go after the leadership of Iraq. And at the last minute, some diplomatic finagling and languages and letters were used in order to prevent that kind of decimation. It reminds me of when the Americans were taking over North America from the Indians, and we were blaming the Indians that they were standing up to us as terrorists, trying to prevent their lands from being taken over by the white man. In that sense, not a lot has changed, but of course in this era of technology, cruise missiles, and instant communication at the communication level, an awful lot has changed. But just to finish the story, I had been promised when I had come down to the studio that I'd be on from 4:30 to 5 o'clock. When I got there, they told me that was confirmed and that I should also stay for another segment, another half hour after that, and they really wanted me to stick around till the end, which was 6 o'clock for them, and I agreed to do so. Then, a few minutes before going on, I was told they were going to cut it to a 10-minute segment, but definitely 10 minutes, and then I could stay a half hour later and go on again for the next half hour. And to all of that, I said, fine. But then you'll notice the moment Israel was raised, immediately they went off to a commercial, which wasn't planned, and cut the whole interview. Well, this is an example of the American media. This is an example of our trying to explain to you what's going on in reporting about the Middle East. Please tune in next week to Mideast Realities, and thank you very much for watching our program.